Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning. As a union organizer, worker safety has been a grave concern to me throughout this pandemic. I'm honored to be joined by leaders I greatly admire, American Federation of Teachers President Randi Weingarten and Communications Workers of America President Christopher Shelton. With educators looking at an unprecedented return to school and communication workers keeping us all connected while we work and learn from home, it's more important than ever that we protect these workers' ability to organize so they can ensure the safest return to the workplace possible. This week, we mark the 85th anniversary of the National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed the fundamental rights for workers to organize a union and bargain collectively with their employer. It also created the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, which was meant to protect these rights. Unfortunately, on the NLRA's 85th birthday, the COVID-19 pandemic reminds us just how much the vision of this act has been eroded over the decades since its passage. That's why I introduced the Bipartisan Safe Workers Act, simply requiring the NLRB to use available technology of the 21st century to allow remote union representation elections due to the risks of in-person voting during this public health crisis. You know, last Tuesday, Dr. Anthony Fauci warned that we could see as many as 100,000 new COVID-19 cases per day. I believe we had 10,000 yesterday in Texas alone. Yet on Tuesday, absurdly, the NLRB announced a plan to restart in-person union elections. This is unnecessarily dangerous. Having electronic voting processes would add a useful and necessary tool to the NLRB's toolbox to protect the safety of workers, including the NLRB's own employees, by the way, while ensuring that the right to organize is preserved. SAFE stands for Secure and Fair Elections, SAFE. And that's exactly what we intend to provide for workers with this Safe Workers Act. I want to thank my Republican colleague, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, who couldn't be with us this morning, for helping to co-lead this bill. I also want to thank Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro and my colleagues on the House Appropriations Committee, who on Monday released their appropriations bill for next year, which includes key provisions of the Safe Workers Act, funding and a directive for the NLRB to develop electronic voting procedures swiftly. I'm so grateful to have bipartisan support for this bill because worker safety should be above politics in this moment of public health crisis and generally in any democracy worthy of that name. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in this situation because of a harmful 2012 appropriations rider that prohibited electronic voting in union elections in an effort to undermine workers' ability to organize. The Safe Workers Act undoes this injustice to workers at long last, 8 years later, and when it is more important that workers can exercise their rights than ever. Along with 48 co-sponsors in the House, the Safe Workers Act is endorsed by the AFL CIO and many of its affiliated unions, including not only the AFT and CWA, who are so ably represented here today, but also the machinists, the IFPTE, which is the engineers union, the transit workers union, UFCW, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, who represent so many workers who've tried to organize in the whole food chain from food processing to grocery stores, and the United Steelworkers. Now let's hear from those national union leaders doing the vital work of protecting workers during this once-in-a-generation crisis for public health and worker safety. First, President Randi Weingarten of the AFT. Tell us what the American Federation of Teachers are up to. Give us an update. Tell us about the educators you represent and why you support the Safe Workers Act.
Well, thank you, Congressman, for doing this. And I'm so glad to be with my dear colleague, Chris Shelton, and others that are on the phone. But I really think it's what you've done here in terms of this bill is so important. But it shows the way in which you already talked about it. It just shows the hypocrisy of the Trump administration, that that they will use every device that they have in their toolbox to actually suppress voting, to suppress workers' rights, to suppress kids having a decent education. They are very fixated on regular folk not having any real power or agency over their lives. This is what the labor movement does. We help people have a union because a union can accomplish what individuals don't have the power to do. A union can help, is the vehicle to help create a pathway to better working conditions, better wages, better retirement security, and a better life. And so this administration, as you said before, has basically done whatever it could to stop workers from having that right. And even so, you see how many workers really want to have unions and organizations. So this is very simply, this bill, it very simply says it undoes the prohibition of electronic voting in union elections and requires the National Labor Relations Board to conduct elections remotely due to the public health risks of that could happen in terms of in-person voting. It basically says you don't have to make a choice between safety and your democratic rights when it comes to your workplace. And as a result, we're completely in support of it, as are so many of your colleagues. But let me say one other thing. Notice how quick the NLRB was to postpone and cancel. At the very same time as the Wisconsin Republicans were saying, no, we're not going to cancel the Wisconsin primary. At the same time as others were, trying to figure out what to do in terms of making things safe, the first thing the NLRB did was to cancel in-person voting, or to cancel those things. And as a result, what happened is it hurt. It didn't just hurt union organizing campaigns. What it did was it allowed, just like the new rules of the NLRB, it allowed employers to actually hurt workers and to actually retaliate against workers. We saw this in our Bacchus campaign in Connecticut. So it's really important to try to do what you're doing, Congressman, to try to level the playing field, give people a real voice, let them make a real decision, but let them not have to decide between their own personal safety and their voice in their or having empowerment versus their own personal safety. Both are really, really important values, and both need to be given to Americans. And thank you for doing this work, and thank you for promoting the SAFE Act. The SAFE Act.
Thank you so much, President Weingarten. And now, President Shelton, can you tell us why the Safe Workers Act is so important to the communication workers of America, who represent such a wide array of workers across the economy?
Thank you, Congressman Levin, and the other tremendous leaders who are supporting the Safe Workers Act. The freedom of workers to join together in unions and negotiate with their employers is more important during the COVID-19 crisis than even it was before. When we see workers be laid off by the millions, other workers facing pay cuts or furloughs, and others being forced to work without the protections needed to keep them safe, there's no question that they need a real voice in the decisions being made that impact their jobs and therefore their lives. Working people in all kinds of occupations, from nurses to journalists to warehouse workers, are reaching out to CWA and other unions to find out how they can build power in their workplaces and have a voice on the job. Unfortunately, our rules for union elections are decades out of date, and it is purposeful that they have left them that way. And they've made it nearly impossible for many of these workers to actually form unions and negotiate fair contracts. COVID has made holding in-person union representation elections next to impossible in much of the country. But we've seen employers like Gannett, one of the largest newspaper chains in the United States, using COVID as an excuse to cancel in-person elections and then denying workers from voting by mail, at least 3 times in Gannett's case. That's just one employer. We've seen it at many, many employers, and they're just using this, as is the NLRB, to prevent people from being able to join unions, as is their right under the National Labor Relations Act. At Gannett, this meant that 150 workers had to wait months, and I mean months, to conduct fair union elections. All the while, Gannett was conducting furloughs and not giving masks to some of the journalists going out in the community to do life-saving reporting. The solution here is absolutely obvious: remote electronic voting. Electronic voting will make it easier to conduct elections, not just during this time of physical distancing, but also other times when workers are physically separate but doing the same work. We know it can be done. As Congressman Levin said, the National Mediations Board has done it for union representation elections they oversee for years. But electronic voting is prohibited in NLRB supervised elections. Why? Because anti-union corporations and their political allies want to make it as hard as possible for workers to gain power by joining a union, no matter the situation. You know, all these folks have a right under the National Labor Relations Act to organize and to join a union if that's what they so desire. But now, besides everything else that has quite honestly bastardized their rights under the National Labor Relations Act, now they have to put their lives on the line to actually form a union, which should be their right under the law. The Safe Workers Act will fix this long-standing problem by removing the prohibition on electronic representation elections and directing the NLRB to develop procedures for electronic voting immediately so that workers who are standing up throughout this crisis to make their voices heard can actually have the protection of a union contract and see their rights under the law upheld. It also shows support for working people at a time when the Trump NLRB has turned its back on them, doing whatever it can to make it harder for workers to organize, most recently by throwing roadblocks in the way of companies that voluntarily recognize unions. On behalf of CWA members and especially workers who are organizing to join CWA, I want to thank you, Congressman Levin, also Congressman Fitzpatrick, and the bipartisan group of co-sponsors of the Safe Workers Act. This is something that we've been waiting for a long time, and it should happen as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, President Shelton. Leaders like you and Randi Weingarten really have been such important voices. And God knows, Randi, with the situation with the schools, we separately as vice chair of that labor committee, I'm telling you, we are just going to have to work so closely together to do the best we can by our kids and our teachers and other educators. But okay, Jenny, we're open for questions or whatever you want us to do. We're good to go.
All right, if anyone has a question, you can unmute yourself. And if we don't have any questions, Andy, did you have any follow-up questions?
Well, yeah, I wanted to point out this idea that we've come up with of trying to move this through the appropriations process. And I know that, you know, President Shelton and President Weingarten have been around the block a couple times with us here, but sometimes that's the best way to get something done. And so I'm really grateful to Rosa DeLauro, who's in charge of this part of the approps process, and the other appropriators for agreeing to include this in the appropriations for next year. So that's another way we're fighting for this. But I think we have to try every angle basically to protect workers' rights. I've just read so many stories. Like, it made me so mad when the CEO of Trader Joe's, I don't know if you all saw this, he wrote a letter to all his employees using the NLRB suspension of elections altogether that President Weingarten mentioned, you know, as a way to discourage his employees from trying to form a union. Who's more of a symbol of putting their life at risk just to keep people functioning than all of our grocery workers? I mean, you know, healthcare, teachers, delivery, grocery, and farm workers. And so, you know, I just think we've got to try every avenue to get this done. And that's what we're going to do, whether it's authorization side or appropriation side.
Andy, there was a question in the chat about the number of co-sponsors you have.
Oh yeah. Well, so that's I think I'll tell you, on this bill, I think we have 49 or something. Let me see, co-sponsors. But you know, it's a kind of an interesting thing. A lot of the way that we get co-sponsors, you know, we can't do, which is hanging out together on the floor. So I think it's pretty great. We have, I think, 48 co-sponsors of the SAFE Act and the Safe Workers Act. And that's, you know, that's happened very quickly and without being able to be together on the floor of the House. All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, I just want to thank people for tuning in and for attending. I really want to thank President Weingarten and President Shelton. All I can do is tell you all that we are really committed to fighting for workers' rights in this country. And this is just one example. This maneuver by Republicans since 2012 is one of hundreds of examples of the legislative, administrative, and judicial moves that have resulted in only 6% of private sector workers being in a union in this country, when just under half of people say they'd like to form a union if they could. So Randi, Chris, maybe we're just going to have to get ourselves a different president and a different Senate to work with us. But I'm just going to tell you right now, we are going to open a new era of workers' rights in this country. That's my commitment to you. You've worked so long and hard to help millions of workers in this country. It's the least we can do to just let workers have freedom to form unions and bargain collectively. There's nothing else we could do to increase equality in our country more than that, in my view, as just one member, one punk freshman in the House of Representatives. So thank you so much for doing this and for your support for this legislative effort. I really appreciate it.
Thank
And
you.
we did, oh, sorry. We did just get one question actually for President Weingarten and President Shelton. From Hassan at Bloomberg. Any comment on why and how the NLRB came to cancel elections for the brief period it did?
Yes, I mean, I thought it was you know, the rush to cancel elections was in keeping with their anti-union animus and with their denying people the rights of representation and of democracy. I don't think that they, you know, part of what we have done since then is push them to reset elections. One can understand if there was, you know, a pause for trying to figure out what to do in light of COVID. That was perfectly, you know, appropriate to try to, you know, postpone, reschedule. But what they did was, you know, was essentially the first thing they did was just cancel union elections. And frankly, they initially didn't cancel decertification elections, just union organizing elections. So you could see what their purpose was and their intent was.
Actually, the answer to that question is really easy. You don't have an election, you don't have a union. And that's what they're all about. And that's what they wanted to do. As Randi said, they didn't cancel decertification elections. As a matter of fact, they made them easier to happen, which is amazing when you figure out that they're saying, well, we can't do union elections, but we can do decert elections. As a matter of fact, we're going to make them easier to have a decert election. This is all about the Trump administration and the corporations and the NLRB getting together and say, we got to keep unions out. That's what it's about.
All right, Jenny, are we good? I know we've gone over our half hour, but I appreciate everybody. Any other questions?
Nope, that's it.
All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you,
Good to see
everybody.
you, Chris. Good to see
Thank
you,
you.
Randy. Thanks for your help.
Take care, Randi.
Thanks, Chris. Stay well. Stay well, everybody.